afternoon, all. Welcome to another session of Client Operating Systems. And obviously, previously, we were looking at the whole concept of Windows 10 application support, right, which is distinctively chapter number 9, as far as your prescribed text there is concerned. Ultimately, just understanding exactly what's happening with your application environments that are literally supported by Windows 10, modification, and then naturally backup of that registry mentioned in the previous session, which is literally your central repository as far as any particular configurations that are done on your system that is concerned, both hardware and literally software related. Obviously, the various types of apps, also working with the whole concept of the compatibility environment as far as configurations would go. Also, I think that was part and parcel of chapter number 8 as well, because remember, 8 was rather short and distinctively also dealt with content that we are too familiar with as far as working with your Windows environments they are concerned, understanding what's happening with the whole concept of the libraries, which is obviously your documents, your videos, your pictures, as a typical storage locations that are obviously associated with content on your particular machine, and also discuss the whole concept of the quick access environment, just how that particular setup behaves in terms of productivity, in terms of using your particular computer system at large. And ultimately, it's also imperative. I think this is the reason why I've been constantly mentioning the fact that you'll discover that most of the content is literally dwelling on computer architecture. But it's imperative for you to realize as well that when you discuss the apps, when you discuss the system, when you discuss the computer system at large, literally it's also important to identify the distinct differences between 32-bit and 64-bit environments and systems, and obviously what it actually means in terms of the hardware that can be used. So obviously, another thing that was discussed as far as the chapter 9 there is concerned, just describing and implementing options for the compatibility I was just talking about a couple of seconds ago. And then obviously with the virtual desktops and remote app configurations as far as your generic systems there are concerned. So ultimately, imperative for you to always literally look at the review questions at the end of each one of these particular chapters, because what they will do for you is not just enable you to understand content a little bit better, but obviously enables you to prepare solidly for the upcoming tests and exams, because you'll find that the way in which they ask these particular questions is literally similar as far as content you'll find as far as your prescribed text there is concerned. So naturally, what we want to do today is distinctively discuss performance tuning and system recovery as far as your particular environments would go. Remember, the whole concept of you having an OS and obviously being able to understand it appropriately is just also dwelling on the fact that you want to look at better user experience, right, in any particular instance. So naturally, it's not just about knowing what the operating system literally offers, but that troubleshoot platform that we mentioned before, that is also relevant in terms of you understanding how to fix certain issues as they arise. And the other thing that you also want to concentrate on is being able to maintain accordingly and being able to optimize accordingly. So not just a question of maintenance of your OS at large, but also looking at how you can optimize that particular operating system so that you get the best as far as functionality there is concerned. Ultimately, not literally just about the OS at large, but literally every particular application that you'd use out there would obviously need to have some kind of optimization that is there, that obviously enables you to use it to the best of its abilities to a certain extent, and then ultimately also look at system recovery should obviously the need arise as far as your particular setups there would go. So literally just looking at performance tuning concepts that are associated with your Windows 10 operating system, also looking at working with a performance monitor. Again, you'll discover that this is also content that we've distinctively looked at as well when we were discussing content within the computer architecture module. But again, like I mentioned before, naturally in this particular instance, you're now looking at more of a concentration on a specific type of OS as far as setups would go, using the task manager. I think most of us might literally be familiar with this as well, as far as the Windows install there is concerned, looking at the performance options that are there, and literally just be able to describe the basic tools that you literally can use as far as generic troubleshooting of the Windows 10 OS there is concerned. Also be able to run backup and recovery, because in some instances you find that your computer system malfunctions or begins to work intermittently, and there's a need for you to look at the reinstallation of an operating system, either a clean install or looking at literally resetting your machines. In certain instances, those particular processes would result in you either losing stored content or installed programs. And ultimately, it's important for you to have an actual backup of that elsewhere that you literally can then use or restore once you've got your system up and running perfectly again. I think this is also some of the concepts we discussed within your security module, where you find that I think there's always some kind of misconception that backup is just a question of you having that on a separate drive, for instance, but that is within the same vicinity or within the same locality associated with your machining mechanisms. If those particular devices either get lost, stolen, or are literally damaged either by deliberately or by your natural disasters, if you look at it from a different point of view, then it means that both original and backed up content is distinctively lost in that regard. So it's imperative for us to ensure that there's some semblance of configuration that enables us to restore content without distinctive issues at large there. So from that particular perspective, obviously your OneDrive there becomes your default go-to from a cloud perspective, but also ultimately you can also look at recovering that particular data using your file history and generically your backup and restore, which it literally is configured until your Windows 7 environments. And then you'll find that it's also important that there has to be some kind of understanding of the different options of recovery that are there as far as an unstable machine there is concerned. So like what I was mentioning earlier on about being able to reset should your machine start working intermittently, as far as proper configurations they are concerned, or literally affected by some kind of corruption when it comes to the boot process or your boot files, if you look at it from or boot initialization files, if you look at it from a different point of view. And ultimately, one of the most common issues at large there could be malware as well. So it's important to understand what these particular recovery options offer, and at the same time also look at the whole concept of being able to understand how they're used, and obviously being able to describe basic functionality in that regard. So your generic recovery, your Windows recovery, your driver rollback. Normally you find that when it comes to your drivers, which we've discussed in detail before, in some instances, there could be a need for you to update a specific driver, but once that particular update is run, naturally you find that your system at large either starts functioning intermittently, or your particular device that you're supposed to be using or interfacing with that particular driver there is concerned starts functioning intermittently. There are mechanisms put in place naturally that can enable you to go back to the previous state of your computer system where it was functioning without precedent or without issue. Same difference would go with the whole concept of you rolling back to a previously installed driver that was functioning on your computer system before the actual update ran. And then obviously looking at the reset that I was talking about a couple of seconds ago as far as your configuration is concerned. So remember, when you look at performance, how do you judge performance? You have to have some kind of baseline or some kind of comparison point, first of all, before you can literally appropriately compare or work with any distinctive configuration at large there, in terms of understanding what performance is all about, and in terms of also measuring the performance at large, right? And it's also important for you to be able to recognize certain glitches in the system, such as your bottlenecks, that literally might arise when certain components or the entirety of the system is not functioning as it should, and also look at those tuning performance configurations I was mentioning just a couple of seconds ago. So got a couple of slides, obviously, we can go through and then look at the practical identification of a practical aspect associated with the way in which some of these particular applets can be accessed and used as far as your generic system at large there is concerned. So like I was just mentioning earlier on, it's all about looking at the whole concept of performance tuning. I think this is ultimately what we were discussing just a couple of seconds ago, basic objectives associated with the actual chapter at large, like I was mentioning earlier on, the concepts associated with tuning, also looking at the whole configuration associated with the performance monitor and task manager configurations at large there. Basic troubleshooting tools put in place, and then ultimately also looking at the whole concept of your backup and recovery. So after this particular chapter, it's important for you to obviously get some understanding associated with the concepts that you find on screen there. But again, like I continue to say, I know I'm sounding a bit of a broken record now, but literally it's one and the same in terms of content that has been gone through as far as your comp arc module there is concerned, specifically looking at maintaining your operating system as well as looking at optimization of your OS. So you'll discover that even if you were to work with the same text in terms of prescribed textbooks associated with computer architecture, that particular section there is also relevant as far as most of the content we're going to be looking at, as far as your generic Windows installs they are concerned, specifically obviously within the Windows 10 environment. So what I was just discussing is just being able to understand exactly how to properly gauge performance. And we were just mentioning the fact that obviously there has to be some kind of baseline, which is literally more or less a comparison point, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. Ultimately, you can also look at a baseline distinctively just as a set of performance indicators, right, that are distinctively captured when performance is acceptable. So this is what you'd literally gauge as good performance or normal performance is, as far as your environments would go. I think if you look at it from a network architecture environment, normally when you look at network connectivity, especially when you're looking at it from the internet space, right, you've got speeds associated with your connection. Speeds associated with your generic upload and download configurations there. There is already a benchmark that is there, right, that will check or that will gauge that or that will typically state that this is the acceptable performance as far as your network connection there is concerned. So assuming you're sitting with a 20 meg line both up and down as far as symmetric configurations they are concerned, looking at download speeds of just for argument's sake, possibly between anything from 15 megabits per second all the way to your 20 there, as far as configurations would go. Basic acceptable performance, right? Same difference would go with your upload. Anything from your 15 to your 20 is acceptable in terms of proper configuration associated with your network connection, right? But anytime those speeds now dip from those or from that particular range we've just mentioned a couple of seconds ago, that's an automatic indication that there could be something wrong associated with the actual connection at large. So you're not getting the desired speeds. There's something associated with a given problem as far as your basic connection there is concerned. It's exactly the same concept when you look at it from a computer system at large, that you already have pre-existing baselines that will show you or that would literally indicate that when the machine is functioning, generically speaking, this is the kind of performance you're expecting. But obviously the moment it takes you more than a certain time frame for you to activate or open a program, when you double click on an icon, for instance, or the time it takes for you to actually access a specific location within your computer system, that's already an indication that there could be some kind of discrepancy that is there. So we now need to start looking at tuning accordingly, or literally looking at the troubleshooting process first, right, to see exactly what could be causing that issue. Once identified, that particular issue obviously needs to be literally alleviated, or naturally look at now incorporating some performance enhancement configurations there, just to ensure that we've got a proper functioning configuration at large. So obviously that also works hand in hand with you recognizing what bottlenecks are, which is literally that particular setup where you find that your system now starts working a lot slower. Why? Because it literally cannot either handle the multitude of programs that are obviously opened or running concurrently, inclusive of programs that are running in the background. Once you identify that, then you can look at proper tuning mechanisms in that regard. So literally you find that these bottlenecks would distinctively occur when there's some kind of limitation in your computer systems components, right? When you look at these limitations literally slowing down the entirety of the machine. So bottlenecks just deal with slow speed or slow configuration or slow, you name it. Anything that is associated with your computer systems being slow is also associated directly with some kind of bottleneck. Because remember, like we said a couple of times before, the whole reason of using a computer system is to ensure that our lives are slightly easier, because you've got a component that is capable of undertaking tasks in an efficient as well as a fast manner, right? So efficiency, part of speed, part of the whole issue of effectiveness. But once that speed is jeopardized, then the whole need for you to use that particular component becomes null and void in certain instances in that regard. So identification or recognition of them is important. It is important rather in terms of you being able to properly troubleshoot your systems at large. So what I was just mentioning a couple of seconds ago, the whole concept of a baseline, just a set of performance indicators, right? And you'll find that these performance indicators are distinctively also known as counters, right? Which display system characteristics, right? And the display is associated with values, because without those values or without that particular metric put in place, it's difficult for you to then obviously look at a proper measurement as far as your generic configurations there are concerned. So again, verify that no unusual activity is happening, and then obviously be able to measure performance indicators over a distinctive period. Because remember, if you look at network connectivity, just for argument's sake, if you were to test your network speed at 3 a.m. in the morning and use that as a baseline, it's not distinctively an accurate baseline if you want to look at it from a different point of view. Why? Because half the time, no one is using the network at that particular point in time. So you're guaranteed to get the proper speeds, you're guaranteed to get some kind of efficient connection. But if you test your network speed at a peak hour, or within a peak time frame, that is a proper gauge of you looking at network performance, right? Why? Because almost everyone is on that particular environment. Almost everyone is using the network. How is it performing when everyone has jumped onto that network as far as configurations would go? It's exactly the same concept where you can't judge your trip from home to campus on a Sunday afternoon because no one is on the roads. So if it literally takes you 10 minutes to get from your household to campus, just for argument's sake, on a Sunday afternoon, that's not a proper gauge of the traffic or the time frame it should take. But if you're going to be judging it at literally 6:30 or 7 a.m., just for argument's sake, or if you're going to be judging it at between 4 p.m. to approximately 6 p.m., where everyone is literally on the roads, that's a proper gauge to say, okay, look, it's now taking me 45 minutes to get to my place of destination. That's what I'm supposed to literally be working with, plus or minus, as far as basic baselines is concerned. If you're now outside the confines of that baseline, then it's already an indication that there's something that is problematic in your environment. If it's now taking you more than the prescribed 45 minutes, for lack of a better example, and you're now finding yourselves having to use in excess of an hour, or in excess of an hour 30 minutes, there's probably an accident on the road, or there's probably some kind of roadworks that are there, or there's probably a particular traffic light that might not be working that is causing that particular backlog, or the bottlenecks that we were talking about earlier on, as far as configurations would go. So that's important for you to take cognizance of. And those particular bottlenecks, like we were just mentioning, obviously look at literally a limitation, obviously, that would end up having to slow down the entire system as far as your setup would go. So when you look at things like disk bottlenecks, for instance, you're having problems with the read-write process. If you're literally, regardless of whatever type of drive that you're using, whether it's traditional or solid state, right? There will still be some kind of read-write process. The only difference is that, like we've mentioned before, when you're looking at mass storage technologies, is that when you're dealing with a traditional drive, you've got mechanical parts, right? As far as configurations would go. So the read-write process also literally associated with your actuators and your read-write heads. When you're reading, you're accessing content from. When you're writing, you're storing content to, right? But when you're looking at a solid state architecture, you're dealing with flash media, bound to be a lot faster because there are no mechanical parts as far as that whole read-write process or saving and accessing content from your particular drive is concerned. But ultimately, you'll still have those particular read-write processes across your particular disks. And again, if you're getting discrepancies in that regard, you obviously might need to look at upgrading the disks. So if you're looking at traditional, possibly upgrade it to solid state. Or if you're already using solid state, possibly upgrade it to a faster type of solid state drive. You can discuss your non-volatile mechanisms that we've mentioned before, which plugs in directly to your PCI bus configurations there, which obviously makes it a lot faster as opposed to having to interface with your disk controllers as far as your basic configurations there is concerned. Or ultimately just literally use, again, if you're going to go with the same type of SSD, a faster type of SSD configurations that are there. Remember, there's differences across the board in terms of the read-write speeds associated with your particular conventions there. And then you might also discuss, when you're looking at page files now, so arguably when you discuss, if you go to the RAM component, as far as your primary storage is concerned, if you want to look at it from a different perspective, we've always mentioned that if you're having bottlenecks that are associated with the amount of RAM plugged into your system, you can play around with the virtual memory component, right? But unfortunately, that is a very temporary solution, because the best thing to do in your particular instance there, I remember, no matter what type of drive you're using, your primary memory will always be massively faster as compared to your secondary storage platforms, right? So when you work with secondary storage to try and assist already physically installed RAM, that is a very temporary solution. So you are playing around or reconfiguring your virtual memory massively temporary, regardless of whatever type of hard drive configuration that you're using. The best solution in that instance, obviously, would naturally be to physically increase the amount of RAM that you've got plugged in, as well as also look at other perspectives like your latencies, as well as the actual speed associated with your RAM modules. That would obviously assist your machine to become a bit faster in that regard. So again, it's important to identify that, yes, while you can look at working with your virtual memory environments there, obviously it's important for you to actually increase the physical RAM modules associated with your system at large. And the other thing as well, yes, while that last bullet point mentions running fewer applications all at the same time, can also be something that is a bit temporary if you want to look at it from a different point of view, because at the end of the day, should you have a scenario where you actually need to run multiple applications concurrently, then naturally your physical RAM needs to be increased to accommodate for that as far as functionality will literally go. So I think if you go to the scenario we're discussing about your network architecture now, where we were mentioning that 4 gigs of RAM, while you're literally pushing it, in all honesty, because your systems end up crashing when you're dealing with your virtual environments, right? Because you've got the 4 gigs of physically installed RAM that is literally shared across all machines that are there. So your physical computer system will need RAM, naturally. Your virtual machines, because they literally mimic physical machines, will also need RAM. So if you've got 3 machines that are running at the same time, which is your physical or your host machine, and then your guests, which are the virtual machines, which is you're going to be a client in your server in this particular instance, and you're sitting with 4 gigs of RAM, all those 3 machines are sharing that 4 gigs of RAM. And like we've mentioned in class, I think one of your colleagues also elucidated on this, that if you're not looking at a dedicated graphics card in most instances, the 4 gigs that you've got installed is not accessible in its entirety, because possibly you're only able to access about 3.89 gigs of storage, right? Or gigs of physically installed memory or RAM, which actually cuts down the amount of shareable RAM across the multitude of devices that you've got there. So you'll end up finding yourself in a scenario where you boot your physical drive, your physical machine rather, which is your host, and then possibly can only work with one virtual machine at any given time to avoid those distinctive bottlenecks that occur. But the moment you want now to have your virtual client connect to your server or your virtual server, it means that both of them need to be on. Right, so it causes a massive issues in terms of bottlenecks in that. But this is a typical example of the bottlenecks that you would obviously experience when you're discussing and working with your virtual memory environment, whether it's Hyper-V or VirtualBox in that regard. So a classic example of what a bottleneck would be. That's the reason why I was mentioning that at least you need to be sitting with about 8 gigs of RAM as far as physically installed RAM is concerned, because that division now becomes a bit more applicable in that regard. So this is what your bottlenecks are literally all about in terms of just basic slowing down of your machine. So you've got your disk bottlenecks, which are associated with your secondary storage. And then you've got your memory bottlenecks, which are associated with your primary storage in that particular instance. You can also discuss processor bottlenecks, right? This is the other aspect that is relevant and necessary now, that the processor that you've got needs to be able to accommodate for snappy computing, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, because you can have the SSD plugged in, you can have X amounts of RAM plugged in, but if your processor is not also up to speed in terms of configuration and functionality or architecture at some particular point in time, then naturally you will also get some kind of bottleneck in the way in which your machine functions at large in that particular instance. So if you now look at what we've got on screen, again, it's always going to be an issue of always going with the appropriate processor right from the beginning in certain instances, because you want to avoid having to look at upgrade configurations that end up becoming a bit of a crutch when it comes to functionality of your machine. So ultimately, if you're looking at a hard drive, that is applicable, right? You are looking at your particular upgrade from traditional to SSD, which is normally the type of upgrades that you're looking at from a kind of disk bottleneck scenario. Again, like I mentioned before, if you're already running with SSD and you're still getting certain issues, then possibly upgrading that type of SSD to a faster one, or literally working with a different type of architecture, like your NMV configurations that we were talking about earlier on, your non-volatile configurations as far as particular setups they are concerned, because that directly would obviously plug into your that would distinctively plug into your, like we mentioned before, plugs into your distinctive PCI configuration as far as setups are concerned. It's actually NVM, apologies on that one, your distinctive non-volatile memory configurations there. So NVM, not NMV, a bit dyslexic in that particular instance. But anyway, make that correction for us. And then ultimately, when you're looking at RAM, again, should your system or your board obviously accommodate for more slots, you can plug in more sticks there, or literally, if you're sitting, especially when it comes to the type of laptops that are being literally deployed in this day and age, where it only comes with one particular slot for upgrade. So normally you find that you've got onboard memory that is literally soldered onto the motherboard, and then possibly one extra slot that you can deal with in terms of upgrading. Then in that particular instance, you know, okay, for a fact that, okay, fit and fine, I'm sitting with about 4 gigs of onboard or soldered memory, and then I've got an extra slot that I can use to actually upgrade my system to its maximum capability or capacity dependent on configuration. So that is a given. But when it comes to your processor, it can be slightly problematic in that instance where if you're looking at it from a mobile computing configuration or a portable computing configuration, then it becomes a bit detrimental in that particular aspect, because sometimes it's quite tricky for you to actually replace processors in these particular entities. But obviously with a desktop, slightly more flexible as far as configurations go. So always looking at changing to a faster processor, obviously within a desktop environment, doable in that particular instance. But within portable computing can be slightly more cumbersome. So it's imperative for you to literally ensure that you've got that put in place. So naturally, resolution, the change to a faster processor, adding additional processors if applicable, as far as your particular boards and compatibilities is concerned, and obviously changing to a multi-core processor in other instances as far as basic configurations they are concerned, right? So that's the generics when it comes to the actual computer system. You've got your disk bottlenecks, you've got your memory bottlenecks, then you've got your processor bottlenecks. But ultimately, when you use the computer system as a complete unit now, right, when you're not looking at separate components, you can also discuss network bottlenecks that we were just talking about earlier on in terms of basic network performance. You're not getting the right amount of speed as far as basic connectivity is concerned. And it's not just limited to the internet, right, or an external network, but even within your own local area network configurations there, you're looking at accessing network resources. You're looking at literally possibly sharing resources amongst computer systems within that environment. If that particular transfer or that particular connection as well is functioning intermittently or is naturally slow, then that could be a basic indication in terms of what that could be in terms of basic bottleneck configurations in that regard. So ultimately, okay, so we were going down, we wanted to go up. There we go. So we're looking at your network bottlenecks now, right? So in essence, you find that literally more common in environments where you're dealing with obviously your servers as opposed to computer systems that are running the Windows 10 operating system at that particular point in time. And you find that in certain instances where you've got a lot of multiple machines, literally, that are accessing a single server, they could cause a bit of a problem. This is the reason why, again, if you overlap to a network architecture now, and you look at the scenario that they've given you for task number 1, where you're looking at the 25 machines and so on, with that particular environment, naturally, you can work with one distinctive server that would obviously be applicable in that, and can still accommodate that number of machines. But obviously, the moment that particular number grows, you now need to literally get a more powerful server and literally get more than one of them that would be functioning within that environment, just to avoid, obviously, the bottlenecks that can be experienced in terms of slow connections, slow speeds, as far as your particular setups are concerned. So ultimately, in those environments, plug in more servers, right, that are relevant. And ultimately, you might want to look at, it's all dependent on the type of machines that you've got now on the floor, right? Where you might need to upgrade your network interface cards, right? Instead of running at a maximum of about possibly 100 megabits per second, you can upgrade that to gigabit speed. You can also do the same in terms of not running with possibly Cat5 E cabling, then move to Cat6, Cat6A, Cat7, which obviously offer much higher transfer speeds. I think if you've gone through the conducting media lecture, you understand the actual differences there between the different categories of Ethernet cabling that is there. So your 5E common standard, but ultimately limited in terms of the amount of speed applicable. But when you move on to your Cat6, your Cat7 in general, you now look at much faster transfer speeds, accommodating for your gigabit configurations, 10 gigabits per second in specific environments, which would obviously allow for and accommodate for faster communication as far as your generic configurations in that particular perspective is concerned. So ultimately important for you to identify that okay, look, I can look at upgrading my network interface cards or my NICs. I can obviously look at upgrading the actual cabling I'm using in my local area network, and naturally also work with the appropriate switches, right? Again, with the switches, you've got limitations in terms of speeds. So you'll need to also upgrade accordingly to what you've got as far as your configurations are. So what this means is, if you literally are working with a cable that provides for gigabit connections, but your network interface card and possibly your switch can only accommodate for 100 megabits per second as far as maximum speeds are concerned, your network will always run at the slower speed, right? Exactly the same concept that we've discussed before with USB, for argument's sake, that you could have a USB 3.0 just for argument's sake incorporated on your computing mechanism there. But if you plug in a device that is only capable of running 2.0 speeds, that connection will always be running at the slower speed. So it's always important to understand that with the upgrade, everything runs in unison. So in this particular instance, if you look at the last bullet point there, if you're looking at upgrading your NICs, your cabling, and your switches, it should be a uniform upgrade, where the NIC can accommodate, in our example, gigabit connections. Your cable can also accommodate for gigabit connections. Same difference to go for the actual switch itself, so that you can literally take a full advantage of those distinctive speeds at that particular point in time. So when you're looking at basic tuning, as far as your performance environments are concerned, you've got distinctive steps, right, that you need to take into consideration. Naturally, we've already discussed and talked about the baseline as far as your basic configurations they are concerned, and then you can also even discuss your comparisons now with the already existing baselines, identify any causes of the actual issues at hand, which is obviously part of the troubleshoot process. And then what are the possible fixes that might need to be incorporated there? Select an actual fix to implement that distinctive fix. And then again, if that isn't resolved, then it's a repeat process, right? To keep on checking what, because it's literally about a process of elimination when you're looking at working with your environments in that regard. So naturally, if it's not resolved, repeat the steps. Once we've resolved, like we've always mentioned, again, this is the reasoning, with that link to your troubleshoot theory in computer architecture, make sure that there's some kind of documentation so that should you experience that same thing again, or those particular same issues, you've got a document of reference, or you've got a literally a reference point that you can use in terms of ensuring that your environments work accordingly. So you've got performance monitors, right, that you can distinctively use as far as your setup would go. There's an actual performance monitor that you can work with, which is literally a part and parcel of your Microsoft management console. It's a basic snap-in that you've got that now enables you to check what is happening with the whole concept of your processor, what's happening with your network, what's happening with your particular hard drive as far as your setup there is concerned. So the basic areas that you can work with in this particular instance would be the resource monitor, generically, your performance monitor, your data collection sets, as well as the whole concept of your reports. So we've looked at this in previous CNOS lectures, actually, where you're dealing with the administrative tools section, where it enables you to access a content there that enables you to see what the performance monitor is all about, what's your resource monitor in that particular aspect. Remember, it's all about just going to your control panel, and then from your control panel, literally, you can access your administrative tools. And then from there, you've got your different monitors that you can literally work with in that particular instance that distinctively enable you to access content. So again, it's familiar territory for you in that particular instance. But let's see if we can quickly go back here and see if we can share this particular screen to go and see that configuration again, so that we're familiar once more with that particular process. But again, like I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, literally this is familiar territory for you because it's content that we've gone through within this actual module as well, as far as access there is concerned. So let me see if I can quickly share this and then go back again to accessing slides once more. So right, so if you look at what you've got in this particular instance, what you'd want to look for there, your control panel. Remember, you can actually search for it or just right-click on your start button icon there, and then from the list that is incorporated, you should be able to distinctively find your control panel environments, or go directly to the whole concept of your management environments as far as your particular setups they are concerned. So alternatively, we can go with your basic control panel there, and as you can see from our best match, we've got our control panel incorporated. We can just select, and from that, our control panel should distinctively open. And then once that particular control panel is opened, like we mentioned before, should it open in your large icons, you might not be able to find the administrative tool. So what you then need to do when it opens there is change it to your small icon configurations, and it will show you exactly what you've got on screen. And like I mentioned before, you've got the administrative tools there. So once you select and click on literally your administrative tools, this is what you get. Again, familiar territory for you. And what I was mentioning earlier on, you've got your performance as well as your resource monitor configurations. So when you're looking at generic resources, like we mentioned before, you've got your CPU, you've got your disk, you've got the actual network and memory as far as basic configurations they are concerned. And then ultimately, when you're looking at your performance monitor, this is where those counters we were talking about earlier on come in, where you've got basic chart types that enable you to see performance data. So you've got your line charts, you've got your histogram, and then you've got generic reports in that particular configuration as far as your generic setup there is concerned. So if you were to open up Resource Monitor here, you'll find that you get what we were talking about earlier on as far as your configurations would go. Right, so you've got your network, shows you which devices and as well as which particular apps are looking at accessing your network, what is the actual speed associated with. Then you've got the actual disk with your program identification platforms that show you the actual IDs associated with the different programs that are running, and obviously on your distinctive disk in that particular environment. And then obviously on your right-hand side there, you've got a bit of a graphical representation in terms of your usage as far as your basic resources they are concerned. And ultimately, you can look at expansion of your disk activity at large for you to see exactly what is happening in that regard. And ultimately, you can also even look at the basic storage. Which particular disk are we talking about in this particular instance as far as access there is concerned? Same difference would go with your memory. Shows you the amount of memory incorporated, how much is actually being used, what is hardware reserved, what has literally been modified, what is on standby, what is ultimately free as far as your particular machine there is concerned. So you can actually see that, okay, look, if I'm running a multitude of apps, if I'm running a multitude of configurations, if you want to look at it from a different point of view on my machine, what is actually happening in the background in that particular instance. You've got your CPU as well incorporated in that particular aspect. What are the actual programs that are there? What is the actual status associated with the programs? What is the percentage in terms of CPU usage as far as basic services in that particular instance there is concerned? So that's a typical example of the services running on this particular machine as far as your basic configuration there is concerned. So you've got your name, your actual program ID, you've got your description, the status, the actual group it belongs to, obviously CPU and the basic average usage in that particular instance. And then arguably you can also even look at just a generic overview of what is happening as far as configurations in that particular aspect is concerned. So that's what your resource monitor is all about as far as configurations there are concerned. And then again, like I mentioned before, we've already looked at what your performance monitor setup would distinctively look like as far as your generic configurations there is concerned. So if you've got your performance and then monitoring tools there, if you click on performance monitor, there should be some kind of graphical representation in terms of what is happening in the background as far as your machine mechanisms in that particular setup there is concerned. So you remember, you can also look at distinctively adding a specific components in that particular instance that you can check what is happening as far as your basic performance setup in that particular configuration there is concerned. So how would you go about that? If you click on your plus button there, you've got basic counters associated with your configuration as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So you've got your local machine setup as far as these particular counters in essence are concerned in that particular instance as far as your generic configurations they are concerned. So literally, as far as these particular counters would go, like I mentioned before, you've got a whole host of them listed there for this particular local machine as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So it's all about which, so for instance here, if we expand on your physical disk, as far as basic configurations they are concerned, you can see the kind of percentages that we are literally looking at, which is your disk read time, your disk time, your write time, basic idle time that is there, and the distinctive average incorporated within that specific setup. So once we look at that, we select all instances of your distinctive disk as far as configurations they are concerned. And then you can always add that and use it as a basic counter in that particular instance as far as your generic configuration is concerned. So once you click on add, as you can see, you now have your physical disks added to part and parcel of the actual counters that are incorporated in that particular regard. And then you can always check as far as your generic configuration in that particular aspect there would go. So that's pretty much that, right? As far, and remember, you can always then remove it should you no longer need to have that incorporated as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And then obviously once that is added, you've got your physical disk incorporated there. You've got some kind of performance that is now being incorporated or shown as far as your basic configurations in that particular instance there is concerned. So that's pretty much that, really, as far as your setup there would go. We've already looked at the task manager as well, right? And if you look at your task manager, as far as your basic setups they are concerned, you can either hit Control, Shift, and Escape on your keyboard there to activate or access your task manager. It will just literally also show you exactly what is happening as far as the actual tasks that are running or your processes that are running, your actual performance, app history, the actual startup, and the users that are there as far as your basic particular setup is concerned. You can always use the performance section as well to check, for instance, the amount of RAM plugged in, the speed of your CPU, and ultimately also looking at the whole concept of your how much particular RAM in terms of addition that you can also look at. So how many slots have actually been used? What can be literally be used as an upgrade? And what is the actual speed associated with the currently installed RAM before you look at basic upgrading as far as your basic setup or configuration there is concerned. So this is also something that you are literally familiar with as far as basic functionality there is concerned. So ultimately, like I was mentioning, I think we can go back again and look at this particular representation. So if you go back and look at your task manager, like I said before, what you're actually looking at is Control, Shift, and Escape. Normally, you Control, Alt, Delete, and then you've got options from there that will enable you to access your task manager naturally being one of those options. But if you want to access it directly, you hit Control, Shift, and Escape simultaneously on your keyboard there, and ultimately should open up your task manager. It should show you the actual processes that are running as far as your particular system there is concerned. So we've got your apps, you've got Google Chrome that is currently running here. We've got PowerPoint opened as far as applications are concerned. We've got your MS Teams and naturally the task manager incorporated there. But remember, it's always imperative for you to understand that as far as your systems are concerned, there will always be certain background processes that are literally running, right? And there's a list of 57 background processes as far as this particular machine there is concerned. And you've got an overview. I think let's expand this a bit. You've got an overview of what is happening in terms of the actual percentage from a CPU point of view, from your memory, the disk network, power usage configurations in that particular instance as well. And then ultimately, should you want to expand that and obviously check your performance as far as your configurations would go, you'd select performance, and under performance, naturally, you've got your CPU, right, to show you what type of CPU is running as far as this particular machine there is concerned, and what is the actual usage currently associated with activity. You've got your basic utilization, the speed, your basic processes, as well as your memory. Now you've got 4 gigs of DDR3 running as far as this particular machine there is concerned. And then it shows you that as far as slots would go, you've got 1 of 4 slots that have been used. The form factor is a small outline DIMM configuration, and the actual speed of the currently installed RAM module there is sitting at 1,333 megahertz. And obviously, there's the whole concept associated with, again, access in that regard. So you can also access your resource monitor from this particular platform as well, for you to look at a more specific overview in terms of what is literally using resources as far as my basic system at large there is concerned. And then, like I was mentioning earlier on, same difference would go with the disk. Shows you that it's an SSD plugged in at 240 gigabyte configuration there. What is happening with the actual transfer rate associated with this particular setup, average response time, active time, as well as what is specifically accessible. And it also shows you the actual type of disk that you've got in that particular instance. You'll note that your Ethernet and your VirtualBox Ethernet there are currently set to 0 because nothing is actually working in that environment. But this particular machine currently connected to Wi-Fi shows you the distinctive speeds that are there, your basic IP, as well as your IP version 6 link local address there shows you the signal strength associated with connectivity. And then also shows you the name of the SSID as well as the DNS name associated with basic connectivity. Also shows you the network type in that particular instance. So this is just the basics really when it comes to your performance and your tuning mechanisms in that regard. Remember, when you're looking at basic processes, you've got the name of the process, like we mentioned before, the username, and the actual user or account that has started the process. Then you've got the CPU percentage utilization, and ultimately you might also want to discuss both the memory in terms of allocation, as well as the description associated with that distinctive process at large in that particular instance, as far as your particular setups would go. So when it comes to not necessarily upgrading, but looking at working with performance tuning, literally remember, you can look at ensuring that you either prioritize the way in which content is displayed on your machine, or you prioritize the way in which performance is undertaken, as far as, so you've got sacrificing your performance for graphics, or sacrificing graphics for performance, dependent of the environments that you're looking at, as far as that particular configuration there is concerned. So this is all about the advanced options associated with basic installs in your configurations at a specific point in time. You can also work with event viewers in that particular aspect as well. So when you're looking at that particular setup, just for argument's sake, what you want to work with is the advanced settings option. So if we close this, and if we go back to, let's open up our Windows Explorer there, and then from there on this PC icon, once we got there, we can select, we can right click on it, and then from the options menu, select properties. And then from your properties, naturally, you should be able to view your generic settings associated with your configuration, as far as setups would go. So what you can then work with is your advanced system settings, which is that option under your related settings on the right-hand side there. Once you click on that, you should be able now to access your advanced settings within your system there. And then from these advanced settings, as you can see, we've got a computer name, we've got a hardware, we've got a advanced, as well as the systems, not forgetting a remote tab. On the advanced tab, you've got performance, user profiles, and startup and recovery. So when you're working with performance, right, you can literally change those settings accordingly, where you're looking at visual effects, like we were talking about a couple of seconds ago, working with processor scheduling. Same difference would go with memory usage, as well as your virtual memory environments there. So if you click on your settings, as you can see, by default, you've got let Windows choose what's best for my machine, right? When you look at visual effects there, as far as your particular computing mechanism is concerned. But ultimately, you can look at adjusting for best performance, right? Or adjusting for best appearance. So you've got best appearance and best performance there, or you can customize it to specify specifically how your display is going to be incorporated there. Obviously, the less crisp the display is, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, arguably the more resources that are availed for performance. But the more crisp, or the better the particular display is, to a certain extent, the less you've got in terms of your performance resources in that particular instance, as far as configurations would go. So normally you might want to leave it in that option, which is literally configured by default. And then you've got the advanced tab, where you can deal with your processor scheduling that we were talking about earlier on. So choose how to allocate processor resources, literally working with programs or background services. But obviously, programs might make your system function a lot better, because you've got prioritization of the actual programs that are functioning on your machine, as opposed to background processes that are enabling machine basic functionality at the end of the day, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. You can also even work with changing your virtual memory setups there. But like I've mentioned before, the best thing that you'd want to do is literally ensure that you've got physically installed RAM that or physically installed memory that can accommodate for whatever you're doing as far as your machine there is concerned. Rather leave it in the automated selection aspect there, so that the system can obviously work with that accordingly. The moment you try and change that, either you pushing it up or down will still literally cause some kind of discrepancy as far as proper system functionality in that particular instance there is concerned. So at the bottom here, you'll find the actual page file sizes, as far as the distinctive drive that is connected there. You've got minimum allowed, recommended, and then currently allocated as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And then ultimately, you can also then distinctively look at, let's go back to performance, look at data execution prevention. And this is part and parcel of the whole concept of protecting against malicious code or protecting against any particular malware. So this is a basic feature associated with your Windows 10 that literally monitors processes that ensure that they do not access unauthorized memory spaces, right? So it's all about ensuring that any particular memory that is not supposed to be accessed as far as any particular program that is concerned. This data execution prevention platform deals with that specifically in that regard. And like I was mentioning earlier on, looks at helping protect against damage from viruses or other security threats as far as your specific setup there is concerned. Naturally, if you want to look at it from a more detailed aspect, you can just click on how it does work there to get an understanding in that regard. But I was just mentioning rather that all you're looking at in that instance is that your DEP, its main responsibility is just to ensure that you've got processes that don't access memory spaces that they're not supposed to, which is literally done by various types of malware to literally take control over any particular systems in that regard. So that's pretty much that in terms of configuration at large there. I think we can go back to our so that's done. That's fine. We can literally go back to the content that we've got as far as our particular configuration there is concerned. And obviously, like we were mentioning earlier on, what you might want to look at is the whole concept of literally troubleshooting Windows 10 errors. How do you take this into consideration as far as setup would go? Obviously, the more information that you've got, the better environment that you're in as far as functionality at some particular point there is concerned. So naturally, what you want to also take into consideration here is, let's quickly look at troubleshooting before we move on to the whole concept of your backup and restore environments there. Right, let's see if we can share this quickly. All right, so this is what we were just trying to put across in terms of being able to appropriately troubleshoot your systems at large in that particular instance. So obviously, like we were mentioning earlier on, the more information you have, the more likely it is to obviously find a solution to that particular problem. So the more information you've got about any particular discrepancy, right, the better situation that you're in terms of you appropriately finding a solution that would work in that regard. So obviously you need to be using precise search terms within your engine environments there to obviously look at generation of results that are more likely applicable to your specific problem in that regard. So you can look at your recorder, which literally is just a screenshot that is captured each time a user clicks on a screen item, for instance. So this is saved in a report, which is a .mht file that literally can be emailed or saved on a shared location as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So literally what it means is that if you cannot literally view a user's desktop, you can use a record steps recorder to literally assist in that regard as far as accessing basic content at large there is concerned. And again, like I mentioned prior, that with these particular apps, you'll find that there will be certain aspects that are literally not included, but still would be applicable in terms of you being able to find content appropriately. So it does not literally capture any text that has been typed. Literally, users can add comments to include information being typed in that particular instance. You can also use the reliability monitor as part and parcel of a way of checking or undertaking the troubleshoot process in that particular instance. And the kind of data that is collected in this particular environment is how many software packages have been installed, how many of them have been uninstalled, what are the actual application failures that were experienced on that particular machine, right? So it doesn't have to be a specific account per se, but on that particular machine at large, what are the actual application failures that were experienced across usage of it? What are the actual Windows failures that have been experienced as far as usage of that particular machine there is concerned, as well as your malicious failures. Miscellaneous failures in that regard. You can imagine what a malicious failure is all about in that instance. So your miscellaneous failures is also something that is taken into consideration. So these are failures, obviously, that don't fall within the category of applications, that also don't fall within the category of your Windows environments in that particular instance. So it's just a way of checking systems stability associated with your Windows 10 installation. So it does that by monitoring events that obviously contribute to system stability in that particular instance. And what we've just mentioned would be a typical example of those particular issues at large. We've mentioned the event viewer before, so we're not going to spend too much time on that one as well, which literally looks at any messages that have been that have popped up as you were using the machine, in terms of, do you need to run an update? Do you need to literally ensure that your Windows Defender is on and obviously has the current updates as far as basic functionality there is concerned? Do you need to check for network connectivity? Do you need to check whether your OneDrive is synced? These are all examples of some of the messages that would pop up, right, as far as usage of your machine there is concerned. So this is just part and parcel of your administrative tools, right? And then literally, once you open it up or once you access it, just like we've seen with Performance Monitor and Resource Monitor, it's a standalone administrative tool that is part and parcel of your computer management environment as far as setups is concerned. So what you're looking at is your warnings. So sometimes you might find a warning to check your virtual memory, for instance, as far as specific environments there is concerned. Look at basic errors that might occur as far as your system is concerned. Same difference would go for the whole concept of your distinctive information, right? So how does it do this? Obviously looking at logs within your Windows logs mode, as far as your event viewer configuration there is concerned. And literally that's the one that is most commonly used as far as your troubleshooting would go, because you've got a list or a record of the discrepancies that literally might have taken place. And it makes it a lot easier for you to identify when they took place, what was actually happening, at what time of day. Was it because a specific app was running in the background, or was it because a specific something was being accessed on your network or on the computer system at large? It all depends. Those are all examples of setups that you've got in that particular instance as far as your configurations there are concerned. So that's just an example of what your event viewer looks like. I think we've looked at this before. So this is just a screenshot of what your event viewer is all about as far as basic configurations in that particular aspect there is concerned. Right. So again, like I mentioned, might not literally be necessary for us to go through that content again, because we've touched on it before. Same difference would go with file recovery and backup as well, right? Because if you go to your control panel, like we've mentioned before, there's a platform that obviously enables you to access this particular backup as far as your configurations would go. So it's literally just revisiting again, content that we're literally familiar with within the whole concept of ensuring that you understand how to work with performance, ensuring that you understand how to work with the whole concept of your backup configurations there. So two major features that you find that enable with recovery. You've got your file history and your backup and restore, which was initially configured or introduced with your Windows 7 setups there. So what your file history would literally allow for is to distinctively look at what you have, what storage when it comes to external hard drives and network locations there is concerned. So it just allows data that is important to be backed up on any particular external storage platform or a network location. And this is obviously user-specific data that you're looking at, and a particular protection mechanism that looks at local resources of the machine that you're dealing or that you're working with at that particular point in time. And then you'll discover that in terms of accessing this particular file history, you go to your settings, click update and security, and then click on your backup as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And then ultimately also, if you want to look at it from a distinctive point of view, this is exactly what it would look like if you're going to be accessing it directly as far as your backup environments there are concerned, right? And then when you look at the whole concept of basic configuration as far as your file history setup there is concerned, obviously just to ensure that the external drive that you're working with, you're looking at that particular drive not getting erased, and obviously backup data is added to that distinctive drive as far as your basic configurations in that particular aspect there is concerned. So obviously there'll be a series of folders, right, that obviously hold a file history data in that particular aspect. And then you'll find that as far as your backup there is concerned, it works within the background while you're working on other tasks, so that it doesn't literally affect your usage of the machine at that particular point in time. So remember, you want to avoid a scenario where if you're working with certain aspects of the system or certain applets associated with your computing mechanism, it doesn't affect what you're currently doing at that particular point in time. So obviously you find that these particular files obviously end up getting backed up every other hour by default. And naturally you'll discover that a retention period for the backed up data can obviously be changed to suit your own perspectives in that particular instance as far as your setup there is concerned. So this will also work hand in hand with that backup and restore that we were mentioning a couple of seconds ago, as far as basic configurations in that regard is concerned. So ultimately, it's pretty straightforward stuff that, again, like I said before, we've distinctively looked at as far as basic functionality in that particular instance there is concerned. So let's see if we can go back and look at this actually from a practical point of view as far as your specific aspects there is concerned, so that you can have a quick look in terms of what this backup setup there is all about. So let's see if I can share the screen again. All right, so remember what you want to do is search for your settings, and then obviously as far as the best match result is concerned, you want to go with your settings. And once your settings opens up, you're looking at your update and security. We've looked at this particular section before, so I think accessing of this is literally straightforward in that particular instance. So you've got your update and security, and then once you've opened that, you've got Windows Update all the way to Windows inside a program as far as your setups there are concerned. And ultimately what you want to access in this particular instance is the backup section that we were talking about a couple of seconds ago, the screenshot that was initially displayed as far as your slides there is concerned. right? And then you can also even work with you're looking for an older backup. You can work with a backup and restore as far as your Windows 7 setups there is concerned. So you've got your backup section there, and then you've got your recovery as far as your configurations would go. And again, with recovery, you've got reset the actual PC, go back to a previous version of Windows 10, advanced startup, where you can now dictate you starting up from a device such as an optical drive or an actual USB thumb drive in that particular instance. And then naturally, like I was mentioning earlier on, should you then want to access your particular, so with your more app options, if you want to look at it from a different point of view, you've got basic options incorporated there. You can look at restoring files from a current backup or see advanced settings as far as your basic configuration there is concerned, right? So this is what your file history advanced settings would look like. As far as basic configuration, naturally, you would set this up accordingly as far as your setups they are concerned. But ultimately, if you were to go back and then select your Windows backup and restore, it's again familiar territory as far as accessing specific content in that particular instance there is concerned. So you can either create a system image or literally also create a system repair disk, dependent on what it is that you want to work with at that particular point in time. And then you've got your, if you need to set up an actual backup, you obviously need to dictate what particular content you're looking at and naturally what you are looking to use as far as your particular external storage device in that regard. So this is pretty much that. Literally, if you're looking at it from a holistic point of view, I think with driver rollback as well, this is content that we are also familiar with in terms of configurations at large, right? Because what you're actually looking at in that particular instance. So maybe before we quickly look at your driver rollback, we can go back and look at your advanced settings as far as your machining mechanisms they are concerned, so that you can look at your system protection platform. Earlier on, we were looking at the advanced tab in that regard. So let's see if we can go back to let's see if we can quickly share this again. So if you remember what we were looking at earlier on, your this PC icon, options menu, or context or drop-down menu appears. You're going to go properties. And then naturally from there, what you want to work with, like we mentioned before, is your advanced system settings. And then as far as these particular advanced system settings they are concerned, you've got your system protection setup, which obviously works with your system restore configurations. As far as your basic setups in that regard there is concerned. So ultimately, you've got about 5 commandlets that are available there when you're looking at working with it within your command shell setup. Your enable computer restore, you've got disable computer restore, you've got checkpoint, and you also have get computer restore point, and then restore computer, which is a full rollback as far as your basic setups in that particular instance there is concerned. So you can always look at configuring restore settings and also creating basic restore points, which enable you to go back to a previous point in time where your machine was working without any particular issues, should you then start experiencing certain issues. The only discrepancy to a certain extent is that let's assume that my machine today on the 25th of August starts functioning intermittently or giving me issues. And I know for a fact that the last time I had a restore point was probably 2 weeks ago, where my machine was literally working without issues. I can roll back to that time frame. So that's literally roughly on the 11th of August, right? But any work that I've done from the 11th to the 25th, unfortunately, is lost in that regard as far as basic access to a certain extent there is concerned. That's the reason why it's important to always work with appropriate restore points, so that should that literally happen, the loss in terms of some of the content that you've worked with is minimal in that particular instance. And then lastly, want to just quickly look at your driver rollback. So to do that, we can go on to the device manager as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And then obviously within your device manager shows you all installed content in that particular instance. So I think maybe if you go to our Bluetooth here and we go to the H2 wireless, just for argument's sake, if you right click on that, you've got your context menu, a drop down menu that appears, you've got your properties there. Once you select your actually, without even looking at that whole aspect, but it's still fine. Once you go to your properties, you've got your general driver details and events. If you go to your driver, you can update your driver, right, for this particular device. So let's assume that the update for that driver does not function accordingly or gives you problems. You can always then use driver rollback. So as it stands right now, if you've got driver rollback grayed out, it means that the current driver has literally not been updated. That's the initial driver used with this particular device. There've been no updates as far as basic configurations would go. If there were any particular updates, then your rollback driver would obviously be accessible. And then that enables you just to go back to the previously installed driver, should you obviously encounter any issues in that particular instance, right? So this is pretty much that, really, guys, as far as Chapter 10 there is concerned. So pretty straightforward. In all honesty, again, like I've mentioned before, this is content that you've gone through before that you literally should be familiar with. But if not, then I'm hoping that this particular session just assisted in you understanding concepts a little bit better in that regard, as far as the whole issue of performance tuning and basic system recovery in that regard. So you've got revision questions that are on page 413. All the way to 415. Please ensure that you complete these, right? Because they literally form part and parcel of your ICE. I think we've got certain issues, instances where individuals start acting brand new when we start talking about ICE. No, we didn't do ICE, or no, there was no ICE that was given. But I've literally mentioned that each individual chapter that we've gone through, at least look through that content, but specifically work with the review questions at the end of each particular chapter that we've literally gone through to assist in your understanding and also assist your allocation of the ICE component as far as marks would go. So 413 to 415 is what is applicable as far as review questions that still form part and parcel of ICE there is concerned. But otherwise, that's pretty much that. I think the next time we'll convene for this is after the you set up your exam there. So we should start working on the assessments associated with the module. So start preparing for the actual test, as well as preparation for the assignment. So as it stands right now, we've literally covered 5 learning units, because Chapter 10 is what we've just concluded. Like I mentioned prior, your learning unit 1 to 4 is what is applicable for the test, which is that 25% allocation. And then learning units 1 to 5 is what is applicable to the assignment, which is a 30% allocation. So as it stands right now, both your assignment and your distinctive test have got material that has literally been covered. So you should be able to have enough acumen and content to complete those particular assessments in that instance. So we'll start working on those, I think, in a bit more detail after the break that you've got, and then we'll take it from there in that particular instance. But otherwise, do we have any questions, contributions, or any concerns from anyone? feel free to use your chat section there. Any questions, concerns, or contributions? I think you can also, let's see here, if you can quickly unmute these. So feel free to state your case there. So any questions, contributions, and or concerns? For anyone who wants to use their mic instead, feel free to unmute yourselves and state your case. Do you have any questions, contributions, or concerns? Okay, something that has come through here. Right, so in Task Manager, so normally you find, obviously, you've got those background processes and the whole concept of the read-write as far as access there is concerned. So whenever you've got applications that are literally running, and naturally you've got some kind of hard drive activity in that particular instance, right? And again, connectivity to the network would cause some kind of hard drive activity as well, if those particular applications are also accessing the network. So you'll find that you've got multiple applications open. You also have a lot of background processes that are running as far as your particular setup there is concerned. Remember, every particular app, every particular setup would obviously use some semblance of your distinctive drive. So if you're finding yourself having your drives with that much of a high percentage, then you might need to literally look at a basic upgrade of the actual drive. So you might be running out of space, or ultimately you're running a traditional drive. If you're not running a traditional drive, then ultimately it means that you need to look at disabling some apps there as far as functionality would go. Does that answer your question there, Jean-Paul? And to be honest, if you want to literally do proper troubleshooting as well, there is that you might also want to check for malware, because sometimes you find that a lot of malware ends up literally feeding on or literally utilizing free space. So sometimes you might find that your environment might have been affected by malware as well. That is obviously also causing that massive high percentage as far as your particular disk there is concerned. So check for those things as well. Okay, and then so activities as usual. Eben always send a mail there, right? So pop me a mail. You've got my email address. Once you've concluded these particular tasks, just send them to my email. At least there's a record of that, and makes it a lot easier. There will be ones that I'll ask you to complete, obviously, on the Learn on the Blackboard environment. Those obviously you've got literally just clicking on submit. If it's a specific type of blog that you're supposed to create and so on, just clicking on submit is good to go, because it's also recorded in that regard. But for these ones, in terms of review questions, just make sure that you complete them and then pop me a mail in that regard, right? And then yeah, I think that should be that. I'm assuming that answers your question there, Eben. Right. Anyone else with questions, contributions, or any concerns there? Anyone else with questions, contributions, or concerns? All right. So seems no. Okay. So any ICE activities, like I was saying, review questions at the end of each chapter for this particular textbook. So you've got review questions at the end of chapter 1 all the way to 10 there. Those would obviously assist not just in like I was just saying a couple of moments ago, in your personal environment or professional environment, but also enabling you to be able to then answer questions accordingly when it comes to your test and exam in that regard. So the activities you've got, so we've got one that we did on Learn. I think the last time we had face-to-face sessions. That one literally you submit on Learn, but then when it comes to the other generic ICE activities, the review questions at the end of the chapters, as far as your prescribed textbook there is concerned, literally constitute as ice. Does that answer your question there? All right, Jenny, does that answer your question? Okay, cool beans. All right, so that should be that then. Thanks for attending. Naturally, keep smiling, stay safe. We will convene for network architecture in about 30. Otherwise, cheers for now.